Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. Today is episode 7 of Azure Zero to Hero series. The initial plan as part of day 7 was to cover Azure interview questions for virtual machine and virtual networking. But I swapped day 7 with day 8. That is because we have been learning about Azure networking fundamentals, advanced Azure networking concepts. Before that, we learned about virtual network, resource groups. So before I jump into the interview questions and start explaining you some scenario based questions, I thought it will be better if we perform a hands-on session where we see how to create virtual machine, how to create subnets, how to create routes, how to deploy a virtual machine behind the firewall, and how does firewall work, NSG work, how does routes work. So if I show all of these things in a practical session, and if you people practice that session, it will be much beneficial than to move towards the interview questions. So I want everyone to understand the interview questions and I want everyone to get the answers for the interview questions. So that's why I've swapped both of these videos. And towards the end of this video, you will also realize why did I do this and how important is this swap. So without wasting any further time, let's get onto our Azure console and start with the video for today. So what we are going to do on a high level, like I've explained, probably I can even draw and explain. So on a high level, what we are going to do in today's practical session is that. So we will create a virtual network. So this is the virtual network. And for this virtual network, we will create a firewall, just like what we have learned in the previous class, how important firewall is. And behind the firewall, what we will do is we will set up a subnet. Let's call it as web application subnet. And in this web application subnet, we will deploy a virtual machine. And in this virtual machine, we will install Nginx. And we will host a static HTML page. The intention is that we can host a 2-tier application, 3-tier application, but that doesn't matter. You can even learn this firewall concept, and we will also learn about Bastion in today's video. So for that, it doesn't really matter if we are doing 1-tier, 2-tier or 3-tier application. And then I will show you if there is an end user, how can end user bypass this firewall? To bypass this firewall, we have to allow that configuration in the firewall, right? If any random person tries to access this application, that is the Nginx application, this will be blocked by the firewall. I will show you. And similarly, if an authenticated user, that is, we will allow certain users to bypass the firewall and access the application in the virtual machine. Similarly, we will also learn about Bastion, where this particular instance will only have the private IP address, right? So you cannot directly SSH into a virtual machine that just has a private IP address. So what we will do is we will learn how to connect to Bastion, and from Bastion, how to connect to this virtual machine, right? So these are some of the concepts that we are learning today. And this is at the high level. There will be a lot more configurations about the subnets, all of these things we will learn in today's video. So please watch it till the end. And I want most of you or everyone, if possible, to perform this demonstration. Watch this video. I will show step by step how to do it. And by just following the video, you should be able to implement the steps. So let's move towards our Azure board. So the Azure console, we will start first of all by creating a resource group. So let's go to the resource group. Like I told you, in Azure, resource group is mandatory. How subscription is mandatory, similarly, resource group is also mandatory. And everything that I'm doing on the screen today, I have covered that theoretical concept in the previous classes. So if you don't understand any concept that I'm doing on the screen, so please understand, we have already covered that in the theory session. So create a resource group. Let's call this resource group as demonstration. Okay, so or let's make it anything simple. So let me call it as Abhishek. Okay, so this is Abhishek resource group. And towards the end of this video, once you complete the demonstration, please don't forget to delete the resource group so that all your resources will get deleted. Click on the next and click on the create button. So now the resource group is getting created. Perfect. We have the resource group. Now let's go towards the virtual network. So just search for virtual network. So I'm doing things in the order. I have started with virtual network. So create virtual network. Subscription is free trial. Perfect. Resource group is Abhishek. Without these two fields, you cannot proceed further. What is the name of the virtual network? Let's also keep the name of the virtual network as Abhishek, right? Totally fine. We can have it. Click on the next button. And here are some security configurations for your virtual network. So do you want virtual network encryption? At this point of time, it's fine. Azure Bastion, just enable this. I will tell you why this is required. And we will use this Bastion instance. There is an advantage of doing this, and Azure also recommends it. So in a nutshell, why we are doing this? Because like I told you, the virtual machine here will be deployed in a subnet, and this virtual machine will have only the private IP address. So you cannot technically SSH into something which just has a private IP address, right? So that's why we will use this Bastion, where anyone who has access to this Bastion can access this virtual machine. And one Bastion can be used for n number of virtual machines also. So within this virtual network, I have enabled the Bastion and click on create a new public IP address. So you can keep it basic or standard. I'm going to delete it right after the demonstration. So I'll keep it standard. Perfect. Did I do it? Let me check. Yes. So I did it, create a public IP address and Azure Firewall. Yes, we need the firewall because we have learned the importance of the firewall in the last class. So let me just enable firewall. And within the firewall also, there are tiers. Basically, this is about the premium of your Azure firewall. Let's keep it to basic or standard. That's fine. Policy. So you need to select a policy. Policy is nothing but how should your firewall behave. One basic example is we will use the Azure policy to allow some users, that is I'll allow my personal laptop to access this virtual machine or the application that is deployed in this virtual machine. And if you access it from someone else's laptop, this virtual machine will not be accessed or the application will not be accessed. So these things we will define in the policy. So I'll say create a new policy and we will call it as Abhishek Firewall policy. This is fine. It's okay even if you don't use it for this particular demonstration. We don't need DDoS at this point of time, but if I have to just explain, it is basically a denial of service attack prevention. So if there is a hacker who is trying to send some millions of requests to your virtual machine, right? Just to make sure your virtual machine is blocked or just to make sure that your auto scaling group does not work properly. So I don't need this protection at this point of time. Then click on the next button. Here comes the most important thing. Like I told you, CIDR range defines the size of your virtual network. So here you can keep it default. But if you want to explore more, like I told you, I've already made a video on CIDR, but Azure also makes it simple for you. If you click on this button, you will understand, like let's say I want to select /27. So Azure tells you that, okay, the VPC that you're trying to create just has 32 IP addresses, which is very less. If you select 18, Azure says that, okay, the VPC that you're trying to create has 16,384 IP addresses. So technically you can create a lot of resources. Let's keep it to the default and keep it /16. And here we have bunch of subnets that are automatically getting created. Now, what are these subnets? So this is the default subnet where you can deploy your web application, You can go here and modify the name as well. We can call it as web application subnet. Let's keep it. But the other ones that you have here, right? So this one is the Bastion subnet, where this Bastion gets created. Automatically, Azure is creating the subnet. Similarly, for firewall also, Azure creates a subnet automatically. And this is firewall management subnet. Like I told, ignore it for today. Now click on review and create. So technically what we have done till now is we have created a virtual network and we have created 4 subnets. One for the firewall, one for the firewall manager, one for Bastion, and one for this web application that we are going to deploy. Additionally, you can go and create any number of subnets. Let's say we are dealing with 3-tier application. So we can create a database subnet. We can create, even after creating the virtual network, you can create these subnets. There is no problem. So for now, let's wait for this virtual network to be created. Oh, sorry, I did not click on create button. Usually this takes a couple of minutes for the subnet to be created. So don't worry, be patient. So deployment is in progress. That means the subnet is getting created. And whenever these resources are getting created, one suggestion that I would give you is, instead of not looking at what is happening, just try to focus and see what are the resources that are getting created, right? And that will give you very good idea of how the resources are getting created and what is the hierarchy of the resources. See, at this point of time, Azure has initially created a virtual network. Then it has created the firewall policy. Then it has created some public IP addresses for my firewall. Now it has created the Bastion. So try to see what are the resources that it is creating, so that you will also understand how the virtual networking is behaving internally. Just it gives you a better idea. Now, once this virtual network is entirely created, what I am going to do is I am going to create this application in the default subnet. So in our case, default subnet is nothing but the web application subnet. I did not rename it. So we'll call it as default. So now we are going to create virtual machine. Meanwhile, this VNet gets created. I just don't want to waste time. So click on the create button, click on Azure virtual machine. Resource group should be the same, Abhishek. And the whole idea is also that, right? We will try to bundle our entire project into one resource group. Like I told you, in real time, resource groups are maintained for project hyphen your environment. So if you have project called Nike sales, so Nike sales developer environment will have one resource group, Nike sales staging environment will have one resource group, and Nike sales production will have one resource group. So depending upon your organization, you can change it, but this is one standard. Virtual machine name, let's call it as Nginx web. Region, let's keep it the same. Better you choose the region that is near to you. I'm actually connected to a VPN, so that's why it's fine. I've connected to the East US. So availability zone, zones 1. Security groups, don't change it. Image, you can either use Ubuntu 2004 or 2204, but make sure you are using the free services eligible virtual machine only. VM architecture, let's keep it the same. Size, we want to do it with the free instances, so that's fine because we are just deploying a web application, so it doesn't matter. SSH public key. Yes, I want to use the SSH public key authentication, and let me rename this to Nginx Web 1 because I already have the key and I just want to show you people. So I'll generate a new key here, generate new key pair. Public inbound addresses. So let me keep it only SSH. Right now, I just want to allow SSH to the instance. And typically, we are deploying an Nginx application. So later point of time in the video, I will go and I will modify the NSG inbound port rules and add HTTP, that is port 80. Otherwise, the traffic will not flow into the virtual machine and the application. Click on next. I'm not changing anything with respect to the storage and disk, so let it be. Networking, yes. Here comes the important one. By this time, if your virtual network is created, it's fine. Otherwise, you need to wait. In my case, the virtual network is not completely created yet. So I will wait for the virtual network creation. So now my virtual network is created. It took a lot of time. And now if I go to the next option, that is the networking tab. Here, select default because I want to put the web application in the default subnet, right? You don't want to put it in the FireNet subnet. You want to put it in the web application subnet. So select that. And then public IP, I don't want to give it any public IP. Like I told you, I want it to be behind the firewall. And also I want it to be deployed in the private subnet because mostly this is how we do it in the real time also. You don't want to expose your application unless it is compulsory required. Okay, now I don't want to change this. Let's keep it as is. Inbound SSH22, this is the only thing that I want. And delete NIC when virtual machine is deleted, select this option. Perfect. I think we have all of these things. And one more thing that we can do here is we can either use this custom data field or the user data field. I'll explain what these things are. Basically, once the virtual machine is created, like I told you, I'm going to put within this virtual machine, I'll log into it and I will install Nginx and I will deploy my HTML application, right? What you can also do is you can put the same script. There is something called as cloud init script, which you can put in your custom data. And what it does is during the creation of your virtual machine, the script gets automatically triggered and the Nginx as well as the HTML page gets deployed on this virtual machine. This is used during the auto scaling process. I mean, this comes mostly handy when we are using the auto scaling because automatically you have to scale your instance to 2 instances, 3 instances, 4 instances. And when this thing happens automatically, you want the application to be also deployed automatically. So when we learn about auto scaling, I will show you this particular thing. And there is another option called user data. User data is basically, you don't want the code to be executed while the creation, but you want to pass some files to this virtual machine. Okay, once the virtual machine is created, let's say you want to have your script in a particular location. That's when we go with the user data. So custom data is only when you create the virtual machine, it gets executed, but user data persists within your virtual machine throughout its lifetime. It doesn't get executed while the creation of virtual machine, but if you pass any file in the user data, that file will be available within the virtual machine. You can stop that virtual machine, start it, but it will be available all the time. So that is the difference between custom and user data. We will use this when we do the virtual machine skill sets. When we learn it, we will use that particular thing. Now click on the create virtual machine because all of our options are selected. Now, when you create the virtual machine, just download the PEM file. Okay. So as you click on the create button, it will provide this option, download private key and create resource. Click this option. And now just wait for the virtual machine to be created. Now my virtual machine creation is complete and all the resources related to the virtual machine are also created. So if we go back to the diagram, we have the virtual network created. We have the virtual machine created. We have the firewall created. Of course, I did not configure the firewall, but it is just created. Right now, this particular virtual machine, I'll go into it and I will try to install Nginx and the HTML page. If you go to the virtual machine, right? Home, click on the virtual machines. So you will have this Nginx web application, instance. And if you notice this field called public IP address, so there is nothing called public IP address here. Like there is no value for the public IP address. So how will you SSH to this instance, right? What is the procedure to SSH to this instance? For that same reason, we have something called as Bastion. So what exactly is a Bastion? So this concept is also available on AWS, but Azure makes it little simple, where this is provided as a service within the Azure. That means you don't have to create the subnet, you don't have to create the virtual machine called Bastion virtual machine by yourself. Azure provides it automatically. When you create a virtual network, you can just select a box called Bastion, and all the configuration is created by Azure. Now, what are the advantages of this Bastion? I'll tell you very simply. So Bastion is used as a proxy between your developers or your DevOps engineers and the application that is installed on the private instance. So this virtual machine that we have created, it does not have public IP address. That means it only has the private IP. Now, this Bastion will help you configure proper IAM policies or the proper identity policies, where only certain people can access this Bastion and go through the private virtual machine. So you can restrict the number of people that can access this private machine, and whoever is accessing, you have the complete information. Like you can audit the people who are trying to access this private instance. You can add security rules at the Bastion level. I will show you in a minute. And all of these things are provided by the Bastion. So now to go to this private instance, what I'm going to do is, in this virtual machine, if you just scroll down, there is an option called Connect. And here you can see Bastion. Just click on this option. And all that you need to do is provide the username. In my case, the username is Azure user, and provide the password. But I don't want to connect to this particular machine using username and password. So I'll switch to SSH private key from local file. So here you will be asked, so this is my PEM file. So I've uploaded the PEM file, and I can simply click on the connect button, and you will see that I will be connected to the Nginx virtual machine. Where do I find the advantages of this Bastion? Just search for Bastion. Open this in the new tab. And this is the place where DevOps engineers can actually perform the operations on the Bastion. If you look at this, there is access control. Like I told you, the IAM, where I can restrict who can access the Bastion, what kind of permissions one should have on the Bastion, right? What kind of denial that can do with respect to the assignments. You can perform diagnosis on this particular thing. You can lock, you can see the metrics, you can see the logs. All the things will be configured, can be configured through this Bastion. We will learn these things eventually. Right now, we are just using Bastion as a proxy to access this particular Nginx web application. For this, what I am going to do, firstly, run the command sudo su hyphen, where I am just changing the user to the root user, right? Probably increase the font size in your video so that you can see it better. And now what I'm going to do here is, firstly, I will run apt get update. So I will update the Ubuntu repositories so that all the repositories that comes by default, I'm just updating them. And now after I update these repositories, what I'm going to do is I will install Nginx, and the next step would be to put my HTML file in the var www HTML folder. So just run apt get install Nginx. I'm repeating the command. You'll also get this in the documentation. So apt update, and then what I did is apt install Nginx -y or -y. Okay, so now let me clear the screen. Nginx is also installed. So the next step that I am going to do is run cd/var www.html. And within this folder, let's create a simple Nginx file. And let's call this file as index.html. And within this file, let's write a simple HTML thing. So open bracket, close bracket, h1. That is the header one, h1. And here I will write, I learned Azure networking today. Okay, just a very simple one. And once you write this, what you have to do is you have to restart your Nginx service. So for that, we will just do systemctl. I'm not using sudo because I have switched to the root user. Systemctl restart Nginx. Perfect. So now my Nginx is also restarted. But of course, if I go to my diagram here, right? So Nginx is installed in this private instance. So how do I actually access it? So the only way to access is through this particular firewall. So I will configure the firewall policy in such a way that if someone accesses the IP address of this firewall, right, on a particular port, I will forward the request to the virtual machine. So if this is the firewall, right, I'm going to configure the firewall in such a way, if someone accesses the IP address of the firewall, colon, a particular port, let's say 4000, I will forward this request to the virtual machine, right? So to do that, again, it's very simple. Search for firewall. You can also go to your resource group and click on the firewall. But right now there is only one firewall on my account. So let me just open it. And in this firewall page, you will find this one here called firewall policy. Click on the firewall policy. And here towards your left, you will find different policies and different rules that you can configure. And what we will use in this class is the DNAT rules, right? That is a network address translation rule. Sorry, network address translation rules. And to do that, click on this button, add rule collection. Just provide a name to the rule. Let's call it as firewall Nginx rule. Okay. And yeah, this has to be the rule collection type, DNAT. And priority, what is priority? Priority is nothing but if there are n number of rules. Okay. Let's say there are 10 DevOps engineers and everyone is writing the rules. Which rule has to take the priority? Probably you have written a rule to allow the traffic and another DevOps engineer has written a rule to deny the traffic. Just a very basic example. So the rule with least number, not the highest number, rule with the least number, and the least number is 100. So the number starts from 100 and it goes to 65536. So whichever has the least number takes the maximum priority. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'll not touch these things. I'll just click on the add button. So I've just created a simple default DNAT collection group. And then I will add a rule using this add rule button and I'll show you how to create the policy that we want. Oh yeah, it's available. Firewall Nginx rule, and just provide the rule that you want to use here. So in my case, the rule that I want to use, let me call it as Nginx rule. And here, what should be the source IP address, right? Who wants to access this Nginx application? So firstly, I will restrict it to myself. Only I want to access. So only I want to bypass through this proxy. So this user I'm talking about is me. So you can simply go to the browser, search IP, or just search for my IP. Okay. When you search for my IP, you will get the IP address. So just copy that particular IP address and go back to the rule here. Paste it. If you put it as star, that means you are allowing everyone. Mostly if you are allowing everyone, what is the point of using the firewall, right? So do not allow everyone and just restrict it to people you want. You can also restrict it with multiple IP addresses, with a particular subnet group, a particular CIDR range. Right now, let's restrict it to our laptop. Okay. And what is the destination IP address? So the source IP address is basically the user who is trying to access. In my case, it's me. And the destination IP address in this case has to be the firewall IP address, right? So here, what I'm going to do is go back to and search for firewall. This is the firewall, click on it. So you have to get the public IP address, not this private IP address. So click on the public IP and get the public IP address of this particular thing. Why do we need public IP address? Right? It's a good question. We need public IP address because whoever is trying to access, if you go back to the diagram, if this user is trying to access, of course, the firewall is again in the virtual network. And if you are trying to access the private IP address of the firewall, you will not be able to access, right? Can you access the virtual network of Google? You cannot access. So what you will access? You will access the firewall IP address or the load balancer IP address. So in my case, because I am not using load balancer in this example, so what I want to do is I want to access the firewall and pass this particular thing from the firewall to the virtual machine. Great. So I got the firewall IP address. What is the port? You can access the firewall on any particular port. This is up to you. You can configure anything, but the target port, that is a port where my Nginx application is installed, that has to be port 80 because Nginx runs on port 80. So I will put it as, let's say 4000. You can put anything. And I forgot to show you this. If you go to your Nginx instance, search for curl localhost :80, you should get this response. I learned Azure networking today. If you don't get that, there is something wrong with your Nginx. You haven't started it or you did not deploy the HTML application. Translation type, IP address, and translated IP address is the IP address of your virtual machine. So go back and search for virtual machine here. I'll explain what are those properties again. Don't worry. So just go to the networking tab, and within the networking tab, you will be able to get the private IP address. Just copy it and paste it in the translated address. If there is a space, just remove it and select the port as port 80. Now, what are these properties? Let's try to understand one more time. Basically, source is whoever is trying to access the Nginx application. If it is one user, provide the IP address of one particular user. If it is bunch of users, you can provide their subnet range or individual IP addresses. Destination. This destination is not the Nginx destination. This one is basically the firewall IP address and the firewall port. Like I told you, you can pick up the firewall public IP address and use any port because probably there can be 10 other applications, right? For each application, you can use a different port. For this Nginx application, I'll use port 4000. And finally, the translation address, because we are using NAT, network address translation. So the request that you are sending to the firewall will be translated to the private IP address of the subnet where Nginx application and the VM are installed, and request is forwarded to the port 80. Click on the save button. Again, because this is NAT, it will take some time. In your case, it might take less time. Sometimes it might take more time. Okay, this is still getting created. So wait for the NAT policy to be completed. Otherwise, you cannot see the difference. Okay, so now the NAT is also created. So we are almost done. Now let's try to see if we will be able to access the instance and the Nginx application. Because from the Bastion, I'm able to log into the instance, and by running a curl command, I'm able to access it. But from the browser, okay? So if I just draw it one more time. So if this is my laptop and this is Azure Virtual Network. So I have set up a firewall subnet and installed the firewall. I have set up a subnet for web application and installed the web application in it. I have configured the firewall. I said anything that comes from my laptop, only from my laptop. I said firewall has to bypass it and pass the request to the web application. And in the firewall also, I said only specifically someone who is trying to access the firewall IP address colon port 4000. Probably if they access 5000, it has to go to another web application that I can configure or another DevOps engineer configures. Right now, we are only focused about one thing. Parallelly, I also did something with Bastion, but irrelevant for accessing the application. That was only required to SSH to the instance and create some deployments on it. Now let's see if I will be able to access this web application or not. So what is the IP address of the firewall? So this is the firewall, public IP address. Let's go to the browser, put it colon 4000. Let's see if I will be able to access. Perfect. It said, I learned Azure networking today. That means I was able to access the virtual machine through the Azure firewall and I got the response back, right? So I hope you understood how did we do it and what was the entire architecture, right? And each and every step I have performed. So you can just watch the video one more time if you did not understand. And I'll also try to provide the notes. Now, a simple assignment for you is just try to play with this particular things. One is the policy that I've created, right? I've created a policy to allow the firewall to pass the request and I've provided my IP address, right? You can provide all IP addresses, do not provide your IP address, try to give someone else's and see how does the firewall behave. And second thing is you can also play with the network security groups, right? Come here, try to say deny HTTP traffic, see what happens. Also try to play with the network security groups, right? See by disabling the SSH access, right? In the network security groups, do not allow SSH and see how does it behave. So this is something that you can play around, and by doing that, you will just learn more things into the Azure networking. But otherwise, I want most of you to perform this demonstration and do let me know how did you find it. So see you all in the next video where we will learn about interview questions.